The evening air hit me the moment we stepped outside, cool against the warmth of my skin and the soft blush of makeup I'd applied with such care. I felt exposed, vulnerable, yet alive in a way I had never known before. Every breath felt amplified, every sound sharper, every glance from passers-by a small tremor through my consciousness. I tried to steady myself, inhaling deeply, reminding myself that I had done this before and survived. But surviving was not enough anymore. I wanted more. I wanted to live fully in this new skin, to inhabit it with courage and grace, even when my heart threatened to betray me with its rapid, erratic rhythm. Walking beside her, I became acutely aware of how I carried myself, the subtle sway of my hips, the careful placement of each foot, the soft but deliberate lift of my chin. The first date had been a cautious dance, my movements stiff, my voice slightly trembling, my mind constantly calculating whether I appeared convincing. Tonight, I tried to let go of the calculation, to feel instead of overthink. Yet the awareness never fully left me. It lingered at the edges of every sensation, a persistent reminder that I was treading a line between two worlds, one I had left behind and one I was tentatively stepping into. We walked down a quiet street, the city lights casting long shadows that danced along the pavement. I noticed the way my reflection glimmered in the darkened shop windows, the way the soft fabric of my blouse caught the light, the way my skirt moved in a rhythm that felt almost foreign. I caught myself smiling, and it startled me how natural it felt, how much of me wanted to keep smiling, to keep moving forward in this body that had once felt like a costume but now felt strangely like home. And yet, even in that joy, a pang of insecurity reminded me that the world was not always gentle, that eyes could linger too long, and that judgment could hide behind even the kindest of glances. I found myself thinking about my past, about the years I had spent hiding parts of myself, molding my appearance and behavior to expectations I never fully understood. How many moments had I sacrificed? How many smiles had I withheld? How many words had I swallowed because they didn't align with the identity I was supposed to perform? And now, walking beside her, hand hovering near hers, I felt the weight of all that repression pressing against my chest. Each step was an act of defiance, a reclamation of the self I had denied, and with every heartbeat, I felt both the exhilaration and the terror of that realization. She looked at me suddenly, her eyes bright with curiosity and warmth, and my stomach flipped. She didn't know the magnitude of what this moment meant to me, how much courage it took to be here, to let my vulnerability shine in ways I had hidden for decades. "You seem different tonight," she said softly, a smile tugging at her lips. I laughed a little nervously, trying to sound casual, but the tremor in my voice betrayed me. "I guess I'm learning," I admitted, feeling the raw honesty of the words, the weight of truth laid bare. She nodded, her expression open, unjudging, and I felt a surge of relief that was almost physical, like air rushing back into lungs that had been held too long underwater. The restaurant loomed ahead, warm light spilling onto the sidewalk, a sanctuary from the chill and the scrutiny of the outside world. As we approached, I felt the familiar swirl of anxiety and anticipation tightening in my chest. I smoothed my skirt one last time, lifted my chin, and pushed the door open, stepping into a space that suddenly felt both safe and exposing. The warmth wrapped around me like a soft embrace, but the weight of expectation, my own and imagined, pressed against my shoulders. I could feel every gaze, imagined or real, mapping the contours of my body, measuring the authenticity of my femininity, and for a fleeting moment, I wondered if I was truly ready to meet the world on its terms. We were seated, menus placed before us, and I tried to focus on the ritual of ordering, the comfort of familiarity, yet my mind was a storm of self-conscious thoughts. How should I sit? How should I gesture? Would my hands betray the subtle strength of my former self? Could I laugh without revealing the echoes of fear that lingered beneath the surface? And through it all, I kept stealing glances at her, her presence a grounding force, a reminder that vulnerability could be met with kindness, that exposure could be met with warmth, that my existence in this space was valid simply because I allowed it to be. The conversation began, small at first, casual topics that masked the intensity of what I was feeling. I noticed the way her eyes lit up when she spoke, the subtle inflections in her voice, and the way I unconsciously mirrored her movements, drawing myself into a rhythm that felt increasingly natural. Laughter came easier than I expected, soft and spontaneous, and I felt the tension in my chest ease slightly. And yet, even as I laughed, part of me was acutely aware of every detail: the curl of my hair, the softness of my voice, the sway of my hips beneath the table, and the way each detail was an affirmation of the self I was learning to inhabit. Somewhere between ordering and the first bite of food, I allowed myself a quiet thought, almost a whisper in the corner of my mind. I am becoming her. I am allowed to exist in this way. The words felt revolutionary, carrying a weight I had not anticipated, yet also a liberation that was intoxicating. For years, I had suppressed this identity, folded it into corners of my life where it would not disturb, would not be seen. And now, here, in this warm, softly lit space, I was unwrapping it, exposing it to the light, letting it breathe, letting it live. And as the evening unfolded, each moment stretched into eternity. The tilt of her head, the softness of her smile, the way our laughter mingled. I realized that this journey was not just about appearances, not just about clothing or makeup, not even just about being accepted by her or anyone else. It was about acceptance of myself, about allowing the pieces of my identity that had been hidden, shamed, or feared to come together in a mosaic that was uniquely mine. And in that realization, in that quiet, transformative awareness, I felt a sense of completeness I had never known, a fragile but undeniable courage that propelled me forward, step by trembling step, into the life I was choosing to live. I didn't realize how quiet the apartment had become until I heard the faint, almost reverent click of my heels against the hardwood floor. Each step echoed in the empty rooms like a tiny confession, a secret announcement of who I was or who I was becoming. Standing in front of the mirror, I paused, breath catching, because the person staring back at me was both familiar and foreign. Her features were delicate, softer than I remembered, framed by curls I had painstakingly shaped, eyes wide and shimmering, betraying both fear and a thrill I couldn't name. Tonight wasn't just another night. It was my second date as her, as the woman I was learning to inhabit, a role I had not been born into but one I was slowly carving out of my own vulnerability. The first date had been a blur of sensation and emotion. I remembered the way my heart had felt like a drum in my chest, every beat threatening to betray my nerves, every glance a negotiation between wanting to be seen and wanting to vanish entirely. Now, standing here alone, I felt that old tremor returning, but this time it was accompanied by a strange undercurrent of anticipation. I wasn't just repeating the experience. I was trying to deepen it, to claim a part of myself that had always been whispered about but never fully spoken. I ran my fingers along my jawline, marveling at the softness, at the gentle curve that had seemed impossible when I had first begun experimenting with lipstick and blush, when the reflection in the mirror had mocked me with its incongruities. And now it felt almost natural. My fingers traced the contour of my cheekbone, lingering over the brush of powder, the warmth of foundation that blended, invisibly, yet profoundly, reshaping not only my appearance but my perception of myself. I breathed in, the scent of perfume enveloping me, a delicate floral note that felt like armor against the world, and a whisper of courage that I needed desperately. Dressing became a ritual, each movement intentional. I slipped into a blouse so soft it seemed to respond to the tremor of my fingers, a pastel shade that contrasted with the nervous darkness pooling in my chest. The skirt followed, hugging curves I was just beginning to recognize as mine, guiding my body into a posture that felt both foreign and triumphant. Every zipper, every clasp, every brush of makeup, every carefully chosen accessory was a tiny rebellion against the part of me that had been told, silently, for years, that this identity was not allowed. And yet beneath it all, beneath the careful exterior, a knot of doubt lingered stubbornly. What if I wasn't convincing? What if the world rejected her, rejected me, before I could even breathe fully in this new form? I caught a glimpse of myself from the side, noticing the subtle tilt of my shoulders, the sway of my hips, the delicate slope of my neck. I tried to hold my spine a little straighter, my chin a little higher, but the mirror didn't lie about my hesitation. My hands shook as I adjusted a stray curl, and I thought, not for the first time, about how much courage it took to even stand here, in this room, before my own reflection. And yet, even in the trembling, I felt a spark of pride. I was her now, if only temporarily, and that realization was intoxicating. My heart raced with the thrill of daring, of stepping into a version of myself that had been waiting patiently beneath years of conformity and fear. Memories of the first date swirled around me like ghosts. I remembered the sensation of sitting across from her, feeling her gaze not as judgment, but as curiosity, a fragile bridge that I could cross if only I dared. I remembered the nervous laughter, the faltering words, the internal battle to reconcile the masculine cadence I had carried for decades with the femininity I now sought to inhabit. And I remembered the rush of liberation when I had realized she accepted me wholly, without conditions, without hesitation. The memory was bittersweet. It reminded me that this path was possible, yet also that it was fraught with uncertainty, and that every step forward would demand courage I wasn't always sure I had. Tonight, I promised myself, would be different. I would let my laugh be unrestrained, my gestures fluid, my eyes open and honest. I would exist in this form not as a shadow, not as a performance, but as a truth I had long denied myself. I took the brush in my hand, applied mascara with meticulous care, feeling the way it lengthened and lifted my lashes, a small but profound transformation that made my eyes feel larger, more vulnerable, more human. I traced the line of my lips with a soft hue, imagining how she would look at me and see not a man playing at femininity, but a woman claiming her space in the world. The doorbell rang, a sharp punctuation in the quiet apartment, and I jumped, my heart leaping into my throat. I smoothed my skirt one last time, ran my fingers through the curls that framed my face, and took a slow, steadying breath. The sound of my own heartbeat filled my ears as I approached the door, each step deliberate, each step a negotiation between fear and desire, between the self I had known and the self I was choosing to reveal. When I opened the door and saw her smile, soft, warm, unassuming, I felt the weight of all the preparation, all the inner turmoil, all the moments of doubt and exhilaration compress into a single, breathtaking pulse of emotion. Her eyes met mine, bright and expectant, unaware of the labyrinth of fear, hope, and self-discovery that had brought me to this doorway. And in that instant, I realized that the journey wasn't about perfection or imitation. It was about authenticity. It was about letting someone see me, fully, without the walls I had spent a lifetime building. And perhaps, for the first time, I allowed myself to truly be seen. I stepped forward, heels clicking softly against the floor, and felt a strange liberation in the way my body moved, in the way my voice carried a gentleness I had only just discovered. Every gesture, every smile, every heartbeat was a negotiation with the world and with myself, a declaration that I existed, fully, even in the tremors of uncertainty. Tonight was not merely a date. It was a reclamation, an act of courage, a step along a path I had only just begun to traverse. And as we walked toward the night together, her hand brushing briefly against mine, I understood something I had long resisted, that the truth of who I was would always be enough if I allowed myself to feel it, live it, and embrace it, step by tentative step. The first bite of my food should have felt ordinary, mundane even, but it didn't. Every sensation seemed amplified, the subtle warmth of the bread, the delicate flavor of the vegetables, the faint tang of the dressing, and I realized it wasn't just my taste buds that were heightened. It was me. Every part of me, alert and fragile, listening for judgments I feared and anticipating every flicker of curiosity that might cross her gaze. I was hyper-aware of myself in a way that was exhausting and exhilarating at once, a constant balancing act between being present and being examined, between moving naturally and performing flawlessly. I tried to steady my hands, resting them gently on my lap, feeling the soft brush of my skirt, noticing how the fabric hugged my thighs in ways that made me both proud and nervous. I adjusted my posture unconsciously, straightening my back, lifting my chin, reminding myself with every subtle motion that I was inhabiting this form fully, that the person I saw in the mirror, the one I had sculpted, nurtured, and feared, was not a costume or a performance. She was me. And yet, even as I tried to internalize this truth, a small, persistent voice whispered doubts. Could I sustain this? Could I navigate the world's gaze and still feel authentic? Would her warmth and acceptance be enough to shield me from the unspoken judgments I anticipated? She laughed at something I said, soft and melodic, and the sound was like a balm to my frayed nerves. I caught myself studying the subtle way her eyes crinkled, the tilt of her head, the gentle rise and fall of her chest, and I realized that I was doing it unconsciously, measuring myself against her femininity in ways both natural and fraught. I wanted to mirror her confidence, to internalize her ease in the world, and yet I knew my own steps were still tentative, measured, and cautious. Every movement, every glance, every smile had become a negotiation between who I had been, who I was now, and who I wanted to become. The restaurant was warm, softly lit, yet I felt the contrast sharply. Outside, the world was cold, indifferent, and sometimes cruel, but here, inside this small cocoon of light and sound, I had carved out a space where I could exist without fear, at least partially. But even here, I was aware of eyes, of shadows, of imagined judgments lurking just beyond the rim of awareness. I tilted my head slightly, letting my curls brush my shoulder, smoothing my skirt, adjusting my blouse. Each tiny gesture was a reinforcement, a small act of defiance, and yet it was exhausting to sustain this constant vigilance, to balance authenticity against self-consciousness. Conversation flowed around us about trivial things, work, mutual acquaintances, favorite restaurants, but I could barely hear the words. My mind was occupied with analysis. Was my laugh convincing? Did my voice carry the softness I intended? Did my hands betray strength when they should have been delicate? Every subtle movement was scrutinized internally, every pause and gesture dissected with meticulous, sometimes cruel, precision. I realized that much of my energy tonight was spent not simply existing, but performing an internal standard I had imposed upon myself, a standard born of years of shame, hesitation, and tentative self-discovery. At one point, she reached across the table, brushing her fingers lightly against mine, and I felt a jolt so strong it nearly stopped my breath. It was an ordinary gesture, nothing remarkable, yet for me, it carried the weight of every insecurity, every fear, every longing that had been buried for years. I wanted to recoil, to retreat to the safety of old identities, of unseen corners where no one could measure my worth or question my presence. And yet, the warmth of her touch anchored me, a tether pulling me forward, reminding me that vulnerability was not weakness, that exposure could be met with care, and that existence in this form was valid simply because I claimed it. I found myself imagining what the world outside the restaurant might think if it could see me now, her by my side, my skirts flowing softly as I walked, the faint scent of perfume trailing behind. I wondered about every passerby. Would they notice? Would they judge? Would they recognize the subtle tension in my movements, the echo of hesitation in my voice? And yet, even as these questions raced through my mind, a quiet defiance began to settle in the corners of my consciousness. I had survived before. I had faced judgment, internal and external, and I had persisted. Tonight, I reminded myself I could persist again. I could inhabit this identity fully, bravely, without apology. As the meal continued, I noticed the small details that I had never allowed myself to notice before. The way light glinted off the silverware, the soft hum of conversation around us, the warmth radiating from her as she leaned forward to speak, her expression open and unguarded. I felt an almost overwhelming gratitude that she did not recoil at my difference, that she did not treat my vulnerability as something to mock or diminish. And in that gratitude, I felt a seed of courage taking root, a fragile but persistent certainty that perhaps I could be seen, wholly, without hiding, without pretense, without fear. By the time dessert arrived, I was exhausted, not physically, but emotionally, mentally, spiritually. Every nerve had been stretched, every thought sharpened, every feeling amplified. And yet, despite the exhaustion, I felt a quiet exhilaration, a sense that I had traversed a threshold, stepped into a space I had long feared, and emerged not unscathed, but unbroken. I allowed myself a small, genuine smile, the kind that reaches the eyes, the kind that communicates presence and acceptance and truth. And when she returned that smile, soft and understanding, I felt a rush of relief and connection so profound it left me breathless. Walking home, the city streets stretched out around us like a labyrinth of possibility. The cold air nipped at my skin, but I barely noticed, lost in the swirl of thoughts and sensations that accompanied the experience. I was acutely aware of every step, every glance, every movement of my body, yet I felt more real, more present than I had in years. I understood in a way that was both terrifying and liberating that this journey, the path of self-acceptance, the negotiation between fear and courage, the reconciliation of identity and expression, was ongoing, unending, and utterly necessary. And yet, as we reached my apartment building, I felt a quiet, gnawing anxiety. Tomorrow would bring the world again with its indifferent eyes, its unspoken expectations, its casual cruelties. Could I survive that scrutiny? Could I maintain this authenticity in a world that so often demanded conformity, performance, suppression? And then, almost imperceptibly, I realized something profound. It didn't matter. Because tonight, in this cocoon of shared warmth, laughter, and vulnerability, I had proven to myself that I could exist fully, bravely, beautifully, in a form I had once thought impossible. And that, I realized, was enough to carry me forward into the unknown, one trembling, courageous step at a time. The walk back from the restaurant was quieter than I expected. The city streets dimmed in their evening lull, a soft hush that seemed to echo the internal rhythm of my heart. My heels clicked softly on the pavement, a sound that had become both a signature of my presence and a reminder of my vulnerability, of how exposed I truly was. I kept my gaze forward, stealing glances at her from the corner of my eyes, watching the way her hand swung lightly, the gentle tilt of her head as she smiled, the effortless ease with which she existed in the world. It struck me sharply how much I longed to move through space that way, with confidence so natural it appeared unearned, and I silently acknowledged that I had miles to go before my movements could feel that effortless. My fingers brushed the hem of my skirt unconsciously, smoothing it, straightening it, adjusting it in tiny increments, each motion a conversation with myself. Is this right? Do I look graceful? Am I convincing? The questions were endless, and yet paradoxically they carried a kind of thrill, a thrill that came from inhabiting a world so foreign and yet so intensely, exhilaratingly real. I had never known that clothing, gesture, scent, and posture could intertwine so intimately with identity, could become extensions of self, not merely adornments. And I realized with a jolt that every step I took was a negotiation between fear and freedom, between old patterns that urged caution and the new, uncharted possibility that begged to be embraced. She turned to speak, her words soft and warm, and I found myself responding with a fluidity I didn't think I possessed, my voice gentle, low, carrying a timbre I had been training myself to accept. And yet, every syllable was accompanied by a surge of awareness, the constant hum of self-scrutiny running beneath the conversation. Do I sound natural? Am I feminine enough? Will she notice the hesitation beneath my words? I fought to silence the internal critic, to allow conversation to flow naturally, to inhabit her presence without collapsing into the shadows of my own doubt. And slowly, painstakingly, I began to relax, my body learning, bit by bit, that the world could hold me without shattering me. The streets were quieter now, shadows stretching and merging with the amber glow of street lamps. Every surface reflected light in ways that seemed deliberate, almost cinematic, and I couldn't stop myself from observing the interplay, the reflections of my curls, the shimmer of the blouse, the sway of the skirt in the lamplight. I felt a deep, almost obsessive attention to detail, not from vanity but from necessity, from a desperate desire to understand myself in this form, to learn how the world would see me and how I could inhabit that vision without fear. It was a strange, heady sensation, the combination of acute self-awareness and profound self-exploration. And then came the sudden, almost overwhelming wave of doubt. What if all this effort, all this careful construction, all this courage, amounted to nothing outside this cocoon of safety? What if the world's eyes were too sharp, too judgmental, too cruel? My chest tightened, my breath caught in my throat, and I felt that familiar tremor in my hands. I wanted to curl inward, to retreat to old identities, to hide in the comforting familiarity of a self that had been quieted, safe, invisible. And yet, even as the panic clawed at me, I felt her presence beside me, steady, unassuming, a living tether that reminded me I wasn't alone. Her hand brushed mine, not intentionally, perhaps, but with casual warmth, and I realized that the touch carried more weight than words ever could. It said, without speaking, "You are here, and that is enough." I allowed myself to take a deep, grounding breath, inhaling the cold evening air, feeling it fill my lungs and with it, a tentative sense of courage. I noticed the faint perfume lingering from dinner, the soft movement of the skirt over my legs, the gentle sway of my hair curling around my shoulders. Every sensation was magnified, every detail intensely present, because for the first time I was inhabiting my own form without pretense, without apology. And yet, the exhilaration was tinged with fear, a delicate, sharp edge that reminded me this freedom was fragile, earned only in careful steps and continuous negotiation with both self and world. We paused at a quiet corner, and she laughed at something I said, a small, effortless sound that made my chest swell with a mixture of relief, joy, and disbelief. I found myself studying her, and in her casual ease, I saw the reflection of what I wanted to become, comfortable, unguarded, fully present, wholly authentic. And yet, I also saw the shadow of my own hesitations mirrored back, the subtle stiffness in my shoulders, the careful placement of my hands, the internal calculation behind each gesture. It struck me painfully that self-acceptance would not be instantaneous, that it required persistent, deliberate practice, and that tonight, like every night, I was both student and experiment, explorer and participant in my own life. The conversation meandered between laughter and silence, between observation and reflection. I found myself commenting on trivial things, streetlights, a passerby, the scent of rain lingering in the air, but even these small moments were weighted with meaning. I was not merely experiencing them. I was analyzing, internalizing, measuring myself against them, seeking validation in their ordinariness. I noticed how her eyes lingered on mine with curiosity, how she tilted her head slightly when listening, how she responded to my words without judgment, and I realized that acceptance, even in its quietest form, was a balm I had long denied myself. Her presence became a kind of mirror, not reflecting my flaws or insecurities, but illuminating my courage, my tentative strides toward selfhood, my existence as a woman in a body I was learning to inhabit. And yet, as the shadows deepened, doubt returned. I imagined the world outside the gentle glow of the streetlights, eyes that would linger with judgment, whispers that might follow, the subtle but unrelenting pressure of conformity that had shaped me for decades. Could I survive that scrutiny? Could I remain authentic when the world demanded performance, suppression, invisibility? And then, almost imperceptibly, I reminded myself of what I had accomplished tonight. Every step taken in heels, every gesture smoothed, every word spoken with authenticity, every breath drawn without apology, each one a tiny rebellion against the constraints that had defined me for so long. And in that reminder, I felt a deep, almost sacred strength, a persistent certainty that I could navigate the world on my terms, that I could claim my space without retreating, that my existence, fully realized, was not only valid but necessary. We reached my apartment building, and the familiar doorway loomed ahead. Both sanctuary and threshold. I felt a surge of anxiety, knowing that the world beyond would demand masks and filters, yet also a fragile exhilaration at the possibility of returning home, of removing not just shoes and coat, but the invisible armor of doubt that clung to me even now. I paused for a moment, inhaling deeply, letting the night air fill my lungs one last time, noticing the subtle tremor in my fingers as I reached for the doorknob, and allowed myself a fleeting thought. I survived tonight. I existed fully tonight. I can continue tomorrow. Inside, the apartment felt almost impossibly quiet, a stark contrast to the city streets and the soft murmur of the restaurant. I walked slowly, deliberately, noticing the way the light fell across the walls, the faint reflection of myself in the hallway mirror, the gentle hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I felt every fiber of my being stretched taut with exhaustion, exhilaration, vulnerability, and relief. And then, in the privacy of this small, intimate space, I allowed myself to fully exhale, to let the tension seep from my body, to acknowledge the enormity of what I had just experienced. Standing there, heels in hand, blouse slightly rumpled from the long evening, hair a little disheveled, I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror. The woman staring back at me was the same one who had left the apartment hours ago, and yet she was not. She was more, somehow, more confident, more aware, more real. And as I ran my fingers through my hair, smoothing the curls, adjusting the hem of the skirt I still wore for comfort, I realized that the journey ahead would demand persistence, courage, and unwavering honesty with myself. But tonight had shown me that it was possible, that the world could hold me gently, that authenticity could survive scrutiny, and that I could inhabit my own skin with a delicate, unyielding strength. Sitting down on the edge of the couch, I let my head tilt back, eyes closed, and allowed a long, deep sigh to escape. The adrenaline of the evening ebbed slowly, leaving in its wake a profound sense of accomplishment and tentative peace. I replayed every moment, the laughter, the touches, the small victories of posture and speech, the tiny rebellions against fear and self-doubt, and marveled at how far I had come. And even as exhaustion threatened to pull me under, I felt a quiet, unshakable determination settle in my chest. This was only the beginning. The journey of self-acceptance, of living fully as her, of navigating a world that would not always be gentle, was ongoing. But for the first time, I felt ready, fragile yet fierce, tentative yet unwavering, to continue walking that path, one deliberate, courageous step at a time. I sank into the couch, letting the weight of the evening press down on me, heavy yet oddly comforting, a mixture of exhaustion and triumph that seemed to vibrate in every nerve of my body. The apartment was quiet, almost reverent in its stillness, and for the first time since leaving for the date, I felt free to truly exhale. My heels, once instruments of transformation, now sat discarded at the edge of the carpet, their click replaced by the steady hum of the refrigerator and the faint sigh of the ventilation. I ran my fingers over my skirt, feeling the soft fabric, the subtle sway of the material, and marveled at how something so ordinary could carry so much power over my psyche, over my sense of self. The reflection in the mirror across the room caught my attention, and I found myself drawn to it, almost as if it were a puzzle I was still trying to solve. The woman looking back at me was familiar, yes, but there were layers I had not fully recognized before. The way my curls framed my face, the soft curve of my jaw, the gentle lift of my cheekbones, the subtle tension in my shoulders, all of it was part of a form I had painstakingly learned to inhabit. And yet, the mirror did more than reflect outward appearance. It reflected the interior landscape, the landscape of fears, hopes, and tentative confidence that I was only beginning to navigate. I traced the line of my lips with my fingertip, feeling the softness, the warmth, and allowed myself a small, trembling smile. It struck me suddenly how much of my life had been spent hiding, folding parts of myself into corners where they could not disturb, could not challenge, could not exist fully. For years, I had adhered to roles and expectations, shapes and behaviors that were not truly mine, that had been imposed by society, by circumstance, by fear. And yet here I was, not hiding, not performing for anyone but myself and her, allowing my reflection to speak truths I had long silenced. It was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure, this proximity to authenticity, this fragile existence on the knife's edge of self-acceptance. I thought back to the date, the laughter, the shared glances, the subtle touches, the flow of conversation that had seemed effortless in its own way. Every detail replayed in my mind, every nuance amplified by the quiet of the apartment, every fleeting expression dissected and appreciated anew. I realized how much courage it had taken simply to exist as her in public, to step into the shoes, literally and metaphorically, that carried me through unfamiliar terrain. The exhilaration of survival, of thriving even in micro moments, settled in my chest, a tentative warmth that I had not anticipated. And yet, with every surge of pride, there returned the familiar, insistent shadow of doubt. Would I be able to maintain this authenticity outside this sanctuary? Could I navigate the next day, the next week, the countless encounters ahead, without retreating into old, safe patterns? I felt a knot in my stomach, a tension threading through my spine, a reminder that courage was not a static state but a continuous effort, an ongoing negotiation with fear. I closed my eyes, inhaled deeply, and imagined the streets, the workplace, the casual encounters that would inevitably test the boundaries of my identity. My mind raced with contingencies, with strategies, with rehearsals of phrases and gestures, each intended to preserve the delicate construct I had so carefully built. But even in the throes of anxiety, there was a countercurrent, subtle but undeniable, of hope. The memory of her hand brushing against mine, the warmth of her smile, the softness in her eyes, it all became a talisman against despair, a proof that vulnerability could be met with kindness, that exposure could be met with understanding. I found myself whispering almost reverently to my reflection, I can exist this way. I am allowed to exist this way. I am enough. The words felt like small sparks in the darkness, illuminating paths forward that had previously been obscured by fear and doubt. I stood slowly, stretching, feeling the muscles in my legs protest slightly from the unfamiliar pressures of heels earlier in the evening, and moved toward the bedroom mirror. The reflection there demanded closer scrutiny, not out of vanity but out of necessity. I studied every contour, every shadow, every subtle movement of my body, seeking to understand how my outward form mirrored, or failed to mirror, my internal identity. I adjusted a curl here, smoothed a wrinkle there, and with each adjustment, felt a profound connection to this version of myself, a version that had been patiently waiting, that had quietly resisted the constraints imposed by my past. Sitting on the edge of the bed, I removed the blouse, feeling the fabric slip from my shoulders, and considered the paradox of this transformation. How something as simple as clothing could serve as both armor and revelation. I dressed back into a soft tank top and leggings, comfortable yet still carrying hints of the femininity I had explored tonight, and observed the way my posture shifted, the way my shoulders relaxed, the way the subtle tension in my hands eased. Even in these private moments, I recognized that identity was not a single form but a spectrum, a constant negotiation between expression, acceptance, and authenticity. The room was silent save for the faint hum of the apartment systems, yet within that silence, my mind was alive with reflection. I replayed every conversation, every glance, every movement from the evening, analyzing both the successes and the missteps, the moments of fluidity and the moments of hesitation. I realized how deeply my self-perception was intertwined with external validation, not in a superficial sense, but in a profound, almost existential way. To be seen and accepted, even fleetingly, was both affirming and destabilizing, a reminder that identity exists not only within, but in relation to others, in the subtle feedback loops of interaction and recognition. I allowed myself to acknowledge the emotions that surfaced: pride, fear, joy, doubt, exhilaration, anxiety, each one layered atop the other, creating a tapestry of experience that was complex, textured, and intensely human. And in that acknowledgement, I discovered a subtle, unshakable strength, a quiet courage that had been forged not in comfort, but in confrontation with the self, in relentless self-examination, and in the willingness to be vulnerable in spaces that had previously felt forbidding. I moved to the window, looking out over the city. The night sky stretched wide above me, stars faint against the glow of streetlights. I thought about the path ahead, the countless moments of negotiation and discovery that awaited, the micro-challenges of expression, perception, and acceptance that would test me in ways both subtle and overt. And yet, in the midst of uncertainty, I felt a profound sense of possibility, an understanding that the journey itself was transformative, that every step taken in courage, every act of authenticity, every embrace of self, even in small, private ways, was an affirmation of the woman I was becoming. Hours passed, the city quieted further, and I found myself reflecting on the duality of existence, the public and the private, the observed and the solitary, the tentative self and the fully realized self. The tension between these spheres was both exhausting and exhilarating, a delicate balancing act that required constant mindfulness and self-compassion. I realized that tonight had been a rare convergence, a space in which vulnerability was met with kindness, authenticity was met with recognition, and identity was both challenged and affirmed. As sleep approached, I lay back on the bed, still in leggings and tank top, and allowed my mind to drift. I visualized the days ahead, rehearsed conversations, imagined gestures, and considered strategies for maintaining authenticity in spaces that might not be as forgiving. And yet, beneath all planning and reflection, there remained a quiet, persistent acknowledgement of triumph, that I had existed fully tonight, that I had claimed space for the woman I was, that I had navigated fear and self-doubt and emerged, not unscathed, but stronger, more grounded, more real. In the dim glow of the bedroom light, I whispered to myself, a mantra that felt simultaneously fragile and powerful. I am her. I am allowed. I am enough. And in that repetition, I felt a gentle release, a soft settling of tension, a quiet promise that, despite the challenges, the path ahead was one I could walk, with trembling steps or bold strides, with fear or with courage, but always with the unwavering truth of self guiding me forward. The days after the date felt suspended in a strange liminal space, as if time itself had folded around me, stretching moments into hours and hours into introspective eternity. Waking each morning became a negotiation between the person I had always been, the expectations I had carried silently for years, and the woman I was now daring to inhabit fully. The alarm's sharp buzz on the bedside table startled me initially, but instead of reaching for the familiar comfort of masculine clothes, I found myself lingering over the soft fabric of the blouse I had carefully laid out the night before. My fingers brushed the material almost reverently, tracing its lines, imagining how it would drape over my shoulders, how it would feel against my skin in the light of day. It was more than clothing. It was armor, language, identity, and promise all at once. I dressed slowly, deliberately, savoring every sensation. The gentle slide of fabric over my arms, the soft tug of the skirt around my waist, the weight of shoes that lifted me physically but grounded me emotionally. Each movement was a meditation, a reminder that these choices were mine and mine alone, that every decision, however small, was an affirmation of the person I was becoming. I lingered before the mirror, examining the reflection, not critically but curiously, as if seeing her, truly seeing her, for the first time each morning. The curls framed my face differently depending on the light, the tilt of my head, the minute variations in posture, and I found myself studying these differences with a fascination I had never allowed myself before. Breakfast became a ritual of self-observation. As I moved through the kitchen, the hum of the refrigerator and the faint scent of toast mingling with coffee, I felt acutely aware of every gesture, every small movement of hands and body. Even pouring milk into a cup became a delicate act, a choreography of self-expression. I imagined her watching, and the thought was both comforting and terrifying. Comforting because I felt seen, even in imagination. Terrifying because the world was not always so gentle, and I wondered how long I could maintain this authenticity under scrutiny. And yet, I took each step, each motion, as a small victory, a rehearsal for the larger world, and felt the subtle thrill of mastery slowly accumulating within me. As I left the apartment, the city greeted me in all its complexity. The hum of traffic, the distant laughter from cafes, the occasional harshness of hurried steps on the pavement. Every glance from strangers, real or imagined, pressed against the fragile sense of self I was nurturing. I adjusted my skirt slightly, smoothed a curl from my shoulder, lifted my chin, and breathed deeply, letting the rhythm of heels striking the pavement be both a metronome and a declaration of presence. I noticed the subtle contrast of light against my features, the way shadows played across my cheeks, and allowed myself to feel both the exhilaration of visibility and the tension of exposure. The world was watching, or so I imagined, and each step was a test, a challenge, a rehearsal for living without fear. Interactions in public became exercises in both courage and observation. A cashier smiled as I paid for my coffee, the gentle lift of her lips echoing reassurance I hadn't expected. I caught a reflection of myself in the glass behind her, and the woman staring back was familiar yet evolving, a constant reminder that identity was fluid, lived, and performed as much internally as externally. Every small compliment, every courteous glance, every casual acknowledgement from the world became a measure of both my courage and my progress. And yet, in tandem with these affirmations, doubt lingered, a shadow whispering questions. Am I convincing? Am I enough? Do they see me or only the performance? The balance was delicate, constantly negotiated, and deeply exhausting. Returning home, I ritualized the shedding of public armor and the embracing of private identity. Shoes came off first, followed by carefully adjusting clothing, smoothing curls, checking posture, and lingering before the mirror. I observed every curve, every line, every nuance of movement. The reflection was no longer merely a mirror image, it was a conversation, a negotiation, a study of how I existed in space and time. I spoke softly to her reflection, whispering affirmations and reminders. You are enough. You are allowed. You are becoming. Each repetition carried weight, slowly replacing doubt with acceptance, hesitation with courage, fear with acknowledgement of self. Evenings became explorations of emotional terrain, long stretches of reflection and writing, notes scribbled in the margins of notebooks, thoughts captured in journals, fragments of internal dialogue spilling onto pages. I recorded every nuance of the day, the smallest victories, the unexpected moments of courage, the setbacks of doubt, the fleeting whispers of pride. Through these rituals, I began mapping the contours of identity, understanding that authenticity was not a single state but a continuum, a delicate interplay of expression, reflection, and adaptation. Each page became a testament to survival, a chronicle of growth, a container for the evolving self I was learning to inhabit. Sleep became an act of reconciliation, a nightly ritual of grounding, allowing the psyche to integrate the day's experiences. I lay awake longer than usual, observing the rise and fall of my chest, the tension in my shoulders, the gentle sway of curls against my pillow. Dreams arrived slowly, a mixture of reflection and rehearsal, scenes replaying moments from the day, reconstructing gestures, testing conversations, imagining alternate interactions. I woke intermittently, noting the subtle tremors in my hands, the rhythm of heartbeat against mattress, and whispered softly to the empty room, "You are enough. You are her. You are real." Even mundane chores became exercises in self-affirmation. Washing dishes, folding laundry, cleaning surfaces, all were observed acts of embodiment, moments in which I measured posture, grace, the subtle balance between effortlessness and intention. I became aware of how I carried myself, how I occupied space, how the world responded to my presence in ways both subtle and profound. Each repetition, each minute action, reinforced identity not as performance but as reality, as lived truth, as reclamation of self from years of suppression. In the quiet solitude of the apartment, I experimented further with expression, hairstyles, makeup, voice modulation, posture. Each session became a negotiation, a study, a rehearsal in private for the exposure demanded in public. I marveled at the small transformations, the tilt of a head, the curl of a lip, the shift in stance that communicated confidence without effort, femininity without artificiality. The process was slow, meticulous, sometimes frustrating, but each day yielded subtle progress. Tiny victories that accumulated into a profound sense of forward motion. I began to notice changes in internal dialogue. The voice of doubt, the insistent, mocking echo of years of repression, began to soften, retreating gradually in the face of repeated affirmation. It was not gone, and it would never fully vanish, but its presence became less tyrannical, less dominant. I replaced self-criticism with curiosity, with observation, with encouragement. How does she move? How does she speak? How does she inhabit this moment fully? These questions replaced the old ones of fear, and the subtle shift in perspective transformed the experience of existing in this form from performance into living reality. Interactions with friends, colleagues, and acquaintances became exercises in boundary setting and measured disclosure. I learned to gauge comfort, to navigate reactions, to protect authenticity while observing social dynamics. Each engagement was a field for experimentation, a test of courage, a rehearsal of presence. And each evening, when retreating back into the private sanctum of my apartment, I processed interactions, relived successes, noted missteps, and reinforced identity in ways both subtle and profound. The cumulative effect was transformative. Days merged into rhythms of self-discovery, nights became laboratories for identity, and slowly, imperceptibly, I began to recognize a continuity in the woman I was becoming. No longer fragmented between public performance and private aspiration, she began to feel integrated, cohesive, resilient. The city, the apartment, the reflections, the interactions, all coalesced into a tapestry in which I existed fully, tentatively but undeniably, as her. And yet, with all this growth, there remained the quiet acknowledgement that the journey was ongoing, that fear and doubt would return, that societal scrutiny would persist. But now, for the first time, I possessed a deep, grounded knowledge that the woman I had begun to embody was not a fleeting performance, not a borrowed identity, not a temporary experiment. She was real. She was mine. She was worthy. And the knowledge, tender and unyielding, reverberated through every movement, every glance, every breath, carrying me forward with the certainty that authenticity, however challenging, was worth every struggle, every tremor, every painstaking step. The morning light filtered softly through the curtains, gentle but insistent, waking me with a warmth I hadn't expected. I lay there for a long moment, letting my eyelids remain heavy, savoring the delicate tension between sleep and consciousness, between the dreams that had carried me through the night and the reality that awaited in the day. The night had been long, filled with reflection, rehearsals, affirmations, and quiet self-examination. And now, as the world beyond the apartment began to stir, I felt the weight of both exhaustion and anticipation pressing against my chest. I stretched slowly, feeling the soft ache in muscles I hadn't realized had been tensed for hours, adjusting my posture in subtle ways to align my body with the identity I had begun to inhabit. I noticed my reflection in the edge of the mirror across the room, a familiar yet evolving figure, and allowed myself a private smile. Her curls had fallen slightly from their carefully constructed shape, but the softness suited her. The lines of her jaw and the gentle slope of her cheeks were illuminated by the morning light, and I marveled at how real, how tangible, how undeniably present she had become. I whispered softly to her reflection, "Today we continue. Today we are here fully. We are enough." Dressing for the day was a ritual I approached with reverent care. Each garment was chosen deliberately, not for vanity, not to please anyone else, but to reinforce the identity I was claiming. The blouse I selected was light, flowing, and soft against my skin, a gentle reminder of the woman I had begun to inhabit fully. The skirt hugged my waist and swayed with my movements, teaching me with every step how grace could be both learned and inherent. Shoes clicked softly against the floor as I walked to the mirror, adjusting hair and posture, watching closely as every gesture, every tilt of the head, every subtle movement harmonized with the reflection I was learning to trust. Each adjustment was a negotiation between past habits and present authenticity, a dialogue between fear and courage, a rehearsal for the world outside the apartment walls. Breakfast was quiet, meditative. The aroma of coffee, the soft hum of the refrigerator, the gentle morning light filtering through the blinds, all of it became a backdrop for observation, reflection, and affirmation. I moved slowly, deliberately, noting how the fabric of my skirt felt as I sat, how the blouse shifted against my shoulders as I reached for the cup, how my reflection caught in the surface of the polished table. Even these mundane actions carried extraordinary significance. They were small exercises in embodiment, moments in which I practiced inhabiting the woman I was becoming. I whispered to myself between sips, every gesture matters, every breath matters, every moment we exist fully matters. Stepping outside, the city greeted me with its familiar chaos and indifference. But today, I moved through it differently. My posture was straighter, my chin lifted, my heels striking the pavement with a rhythm that felt at once deliberate and natural. Every glance from passers-by, every murmur of conversation in the distance, every subtle sound of movement became part of the sensory tapestry I was learning to navigate, neither fearing nor overanalyzing, but acknowledging and integrating. I was aware of myself in ways both exhausting and exhilarating, the heightened consciousness of being observed transforming into a quiet strength rather than paralyzing fear. Interactions with the world, once intimidating, began to feel like exercises in subtle negotiation. At a small cafe, the barista greeted me warmly, nodding my order without hesitation. I caught my reflection in the glass partition, observing the soft sway of my hair, the tilt of my head, the gentle lift of my eyes as I smiled. It was not perfection I sought, but authenticity, and in this ordinary transaction, I felt a deep sense of alignment, a quiet thrill that the woman I had carefully nurtured could exist openly, in public, without collapsing under scrutiny. The day unfolded in a continuous flow of observation and reflection. I navigated errands, casual social encounters, and the hum of the city with careful attention to posture, gesture, and voice, while simultaneously noting internal responses. The flutter of anxiety, the rush of pride, the quiet satisfaction in small victories, the humbling acknowledgement of areas yet to be mastered. Every interaction was both rehearsal and reinforcement, a negotiation between the self I had been and the self I was becoming. And slowly, inexorably, I began to perceive a continuity, a seamlessness between private and public existence that had once seemed impossible. Returning home, the ritual of shedding public armor felt almost sacred. Shoes were removed deliberately, clothing adjusted, curls smoothed, posture realigned. The mirror became a companion, a confidant, a witness to every nuance of transformation and self-realization. I studied her face, her shoulders, the gentle sway of her hips, and allowed myself to feel the full spectrum of emotions: pride, gratitude, relief, excitement, and even lingering doubt. But even doubt no longer dominated. It was a companion, a subtle whisper reminding me that growth was ongoing, that courage was earned in daily practice, that authenticity required vigilance, patience, and persistence. The afternoon was devoted to self-exploration, an immersion in the subtle arts of embodiment. I experimented with hairstyles, testing different curls, adjusting volume and parting, noting how slight variations affected the overall perception of femininity. I practiced speech in quiet corners, modulating tone and cadence, observing how each inflection carried the presence I desired. Posture exercises, stretching, and small movements in front of mirrors became rituals of mastery, ways to integrate body and mind, identity and form. Each repetition was both rehearsal and meditation, each act of care a declaration that I was worthy, capable, and allowed to exist fully. Evening approached, and with it came the quiet reflection of solitude. I lit a small lamp, casting warm light across the room, and sat before the mirror, notebook in hand, chronicling observations, thoughts, and feelings. Every nuance of the day, the glances, gestures, small successes, moments of hesitation, was recorded, examined, and celebrated. I wrote not for an audience but for myself, a testament to perseverance, courage, and transformation. Each word on the page became a thread in the tapestry of identity, a stitch weaving together past, present, and future selves into a coherent, living whole. Night descended, and I lay on the bed, soft sheets cradling my body, reflection in the dimly lit mirror across the room. I allowed myself the rare luxury of uninterrupted introspection. I traced the contours of my face with fingertips, observed the subtle interplay of light and shadow, and felt a deep, grounding satisfaction in the woman who had emerged through months of exploration, courage, and self-acceptance. The reflection was no longer a stranger. It was an ally, a companion, a living proof of resilience and growth. I whispered softly, as if invoking a sacred truth: "You are enough. You are allowed. You are her." Sleep came slowly, weaving through dreams that mirrored the day's lessons, the evening's triumphs, and the persistent whisper of potential yet to be realized. In dreams, I moved through spaces confidently, effortlessly, inhabiting the woman I had become with grace and fluidity. I awoke in the quiet pre-dawn hours, chest full of warmth, mind alight with reflection, and realized with profound clarity that the journey of self-acceptance was not linear, nor finite. It was ongoing, a delicate dance of courage, practice, observation, and grace. And yet, tonight, as I lay beneath the gentle hum of the city, bathed in the soft light of a lamp and the quiet pulse of my own heartbeat, I felt a sense of completion, fragile but undeniable. A culmination not of perfection, but of relentless authenticity, unwavering commitment, and the courage to exist fully in every fiber of my being. For the first time, I understood what it meant to integrate self and identity, private and public, vulnerability and strength. The woman I had become was not a temporary experiment, not a borrowed identity, not a fleeting performance. She was real. She was mine. She was complete. And in that realization, as dawn began to bleed softly through the curtains, I allowed myself a rare, profound smile, a smile that reached deep into my soul, a smile that said, "We have arrived, at last, fully, and with courage unshaken, into the life we were always meant to live.